just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories. Darren Osborne, the man who deliberately drove a van into a group of Muslims in Finsbury Park in North London last June, has been found guilty of murder and attempted murder. Theresa May has insisted that EU citizens who come to the UK during the Brexit transition period cannot have the same rights as those who arrived before, despite the European Union saying the issue is not up for negotiation. The Prime Minister's agreed a joint trade and investment review with China as the first stage of a post-Brexit deal, as she confirmed £9 billion worth of business deals are being signed during her three-day trip to the country. Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Sodha and the political journalist Isabel Oakeshott. So let's see what's on some of those front pages now. Devious and hate-filled, the Metro's take on Darren Osborne, the man found guilty of attacking worshippers outside the Finsbury Park Mosque. That story also makes the front of the Eye with the headline, "Guilty of Murder at the Mosque." 73% of us would be willing to pay more tax to save the NHS. That's the top story in the Daily Mirror. And staying with the NHS, the Telegraph leads on a warning that the staggering cost of compensation payments to the victims of NHS mistakes could bankrupt the health service. The Guardian's front page features proposals by the Shadow Housing Secretary to force landowners to sell sites to the state for knockdown prices to make it easier to build council houses. The Express warns that heavy snorers are 3 times more likely to develop dementia, according to researchers in Australia. The Financial Times leads with a threat from Brussels to impose sanctions on the UK post-Brexit to stop it undercutting the EU economy. And we're joined tonight by Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. Good evening to you both. We're all looking very bright here in the studio to kick off our paper review. And we're going to start with the Mosque attack, which is dominating several of the papers, but with the Metro, devious and hate-filled, the headline there.
Yeah, so we've been waiting for kind of the outcome of this court case for sort of a number of months, and Darren Osborne has been found guilty now of murder and attempted murder. He was a man who drove his van outside a mosque in Finsbury Park into a group of people. One man was very, very tragically killed. And I think some of the things that have come out from this case in the wake of the verdict today, we now know that he got radicalised by far-right anti-Islamic propaganda. You know, very, very quickly, he was looking at this material online. Within the space of a month, he originally saw a BBC dramatisation of some of the grooming that happened. I think it was in Rochdale, and that was perpetrated by a group of sort of Pakistani Muslim men, and that was portrayed in the documentary. And then following that, he went and looked at far-right material online. And I think there's going to be a lot of questions asked in the wake of this verdict about the scale of far-right radicalisation in this country. I mean, this case obviously comes, you know, in the wake of the tragic murder of Joe Cox by a far-right terrorist, you know, not that long ago. And, you know, if you look at the government's anti-radicalisation programme, Prevent, I think it's about 1/3 of referrals to that programme are actually for far-right terrorism. So we quite rightly spend a lot of time talking about the sort of terrorism perpetrated by actors, you know, like Islamic State and people who've been radicalised by the so-called Islamic State. But I think we're going to increasingly, and indeed Scotland Yard are warning, we need to also be thinking about the radicalisation of people who are vulnerable to far-right views as well.
Yeah, and Isabel, I mean, Sonia mentioned it there, that what is terrifying about this particular case was the speed with which he was radicalised within 3 weeks.
I think Sonia gave a pretty fantastic summary of that, actually. I couldn't have put it better myself. All her points were really reasonable. Unusual for me to be so nice to you. The only other thing I would say, though, is I think sometimes it can be difficult to know to what extent you can draw broader lessons from a case like this, where someone is clearly fundamentally very troubled. And, you know, I'm not saying I have a view one way or another on this, but in some cases you've got someone who's basically got serious mental health problems, or
his ex-partner described him as a ticking time bomb.
Right. So are we then to conclude that, you know, this is an isolated case and he's basically, for want of a better word, a bit of a nutter, or are there broader lessons to be learned? And I think Sonia is absolutely right about more attention probably needs to be paid to the propensity to far right-wing extremism in this country. But I would just caution against hastily drawing hugely broad conclusions from what happily is a very isolated case.
Yeah, but I mean, it is something that Scotland Yard are looking into, the rise of right-wing extremism, the proliferation of material online, and that is what Darren Osborne was doing. He went online and looked at material from the English Defence League, from Britain First. The Telegraph here, Yard right-wing warning on this. And he was brainwashed, as the Telegraph says, in just 3 weeks. How does the police force deal with that?
Well, I think there are real questions to be asked about the nature of this material, how it's allowed to sit online. And indeed, we've seen a lot of stuff from government in the past few months saying they want to clamp down harder on tech companies. I think there's an interesting difference, though. In the UK, we've seen a lot of warm words from the Prime Minister on that, but we've taken less action than some other countries have. So, for example, Germany's been much tougher in terms of saying to platforms like YouTube, you're a publisher, you're not just a social media platform, you have to take down some of this really disturbing content within hours of it going up. And I think there's more that government could do.
That was the focus of Theresa May's speech at Davos, wasn't it?
It was the focus, but she's given that speech probably about 4 or 5 times now. We've heard that message from the Prime Minister, and the same sort of measures that we see in countries like Germany don't seem to be forthcoming. I mean, to be fair, it is a difficult issue. These things aren't easily solved, but I definitely think that there's more that you can do. But I think, I think it would be wrong to write this off just as an isolated incident or as a nutter. I think there's evidence that there should be a growing concern about this, and indeed I don't think that Scotland Yard would be warning about it. And I think going back to that fact that a third of referrals to prevent the government's anti-radicalisation programme, everyone sees that as a sort of programme that's for Muslims who are at risk of radicalisation. A third of them are for people, who have been. People are worried about being vulnerable to far-right terrorism. So I think this is definitely something we've got to be very aware of.
OK, let's move on to the front of the FT. Brussels lining up sanctions to stop Britain undercutting the EU economy.
So this is an interesting story because it really is about the extent to which Brussels sort of wishes us well or otherwise when we eventually leave the EU. And the suggestion is that Brussels wants to make sure that we can't kind of undercut them after we leave, and when hopefully we're going to be so successful. There is a debate about that, and it's a question for them of getting the right balance. And I think at this point, it's a very sensitive point in our negotiations for leaving the EU. Theresa May has a very tough job. She's going to have to be extremely robust to make clear that she is not going to be sort of walked all over. And that is particularly difficult for her at the moment when she's being pulled in all directions by her own backbenchers. There's a powerful group of Brexiteers within the Tory Parliamentary Party, some 60 plus of them, who are now beginning to become, rather belatedly I should say, a lot more organised. And
under the leadership of Jacob Rees-Mogg, we're seeing him
the Mogster.
More, yeah.
What is he, the Mog or the Mogster? I don't know.
I think there's a new trend referred to as Mogmentum.
Yes.
You sound a bit unconvinced by Mogmentum.
Does that surprise you?
But Theresa May trying to talk up progress in China, £9 billion of deals gone, but it's overwhelmed by the noises from her backbenchers and continuing strife within the Tory party.
Well, that's because people are so worried. I mean, within the Conservative Party, and not just within the Conservative Party, but all Brexiteers, everybody who voted Brexit wants to see this delivered in the way that they envisage. Now, the problem is everybody has different visions of what it was going to be like, but I think all that noise is a reflection of the depth of nerves amongst Brexit supporters at the moment that there will be some kind of sellout.
And I think it reflects also the fact that up till now, the Prime Minister hasn't. I think there's some very difficult trade-offs that Britain needs to pick between as we look to leave the EU. We can't have our cake and eat it. We can either have a deal that's very, very close to the EU, but we will have to accept certain things like freedom of movement, and there won't be great economic costs of that. Or we can say, no, we don't like your policy around free movement of people, so we're going to actually have a kind of a cleaner break. And that, I think, will create, and certainly the Treasury thinks, we know from the leaked analysis this week, will create
because their analysis are so brilliant, aren't they? Their record of predicting anything has been utterly woeful. So I'm not remotely rattled by that.
It will create great economic costs. But just to sort of come back to the point, so up till now, the Prime Minister has not had to say how she's going to pick between these things, how she's going to pick a way through. That becomes increasingly more and more difficult as you move closer to the Article 50 deadline.
Hence the lead or leave type headlines we're starting to see, the accusations of timidity.
Yeah, and both camps starting to try and, it's only going to get more difficult for her, I think.
OK, very briefly, let's just have a quick look at the Telegraph. Ministers watering down the EU Migrant Plan. I mean, this issue regarding EU migrants and citizenship is a real bone of contention.
Absolutely, and there are various scenarios that have been drawn up under which there is some suggestion that in certain scenarios there would only be 40,000 fewer EU migrants coming into the UK annually, and other scenarios, if we had a sort of so-called harder Brexit, there would be a far greater reduction. And I think this is all quite confusing at this stage, but I mean, even 40,000 less, I'm sure, would please some people, but it would be a drop in the ocean relative to the overall picture.
OK, let's take a pause now. We're going to take a short break, but coming up, how much more tax would you pay for a better NHS? We'll be discussing it in just a moment.